Aparecida had taken care of her employer's mother when his own son wouldn't, and for that, she was fired. Henry looked at her and said, "You can pack your things. You don't work here anymore." She left without a chance to explain, went to say goodbye to the elderly lady, and when she returned to the hallway, his mother was behind her, in a wheelchair, purse on her lap, ready to leave with her. The millionaire ran down the stairs and stood frozen in the doorway, unable to speak, because his mother had decided to leave with the housekeeper. Aparecida was 42 years old, with hands that told a story without needing words. She had raised her daughter alone after her husband left, washing other people's clothes for years until she found something more stable. When the cleaner's position at the Thompson Manor appeared, she didn't hesitate. She interviewed with her head held high, spoke little, listened to everything, and was called the following week. The manor was enormous. It was the kind of place where every room had a purpose, and every purpose had a rule. Marble on the entrance floor, a garden meticulously trimmed, a dining room with chairs that looked never to have been used. Aparecida quickly learned that silence was the prevailing currency of that house. No one spoke more than necessary. No one asked anything beyond their own duties. Henry Thompson was the kind of man who filled a space without needing to raise his voice. Tall, always in dark clothes, always with a phone in hand or his head deep in another meeting. He commanded one of the largest construction companies in the province and treated his office with more care than he treated any room in that house. He arrived early, left late, and barely stopped for lunch amidst it all. Aparecida learned to work at his pace, fast, invisible, without needing to be noticed. His wife, Isabella, was another story. 38 years old, hair always in place, a smile that appeared at the right moment and faded when the moment passed. She treated the staff with a polished demeanor that seemed rehearsed, the kind that neither warmed nor cooled, never shouted, never praised, only observed with that calm gaze of someone calculating something they hadn't yet decided to reveal. Aparecida noticed all of this in the first week and decided the best course of action was to work well and avoid trouble. What she hadn't noticed yet was the back room. It was down the furthest corridor from the service wing. At the end of a bend, the house's blueprint seemed to have deliberately hidden. The door was always closed. No staff member commented on what was inside. And Aparecida had learned that in other people's homes, one doesn't ask what isn't asked. It was in her third week that she entered for the first time. The nurse had asked her to mop the floor while taking the elderly lady to the washroom. Aparecida entered with a bucket, worked quickly, and left without looking up. But she saw enough. A wheelchair leaned against the window. A shelf with old photos no one had dusted in a while. A cold teacup on the small table, and an elderly lady with white hair sitting in the armchair near the window, gazing at the garden with the expression of someone who had stopped waiting for anything a long time ago. Aparecida returned with the empty bucket, changed the water, and went to clean the corridor. That image stayed in her mind for the rest of the day. In the following weeks, she followed the room's routine without deviation. She arrived, cleaned, changed the flowers when necessary, and left. The lady, Mrs. Eleanor, as the nurse called her, didn't speak. She remained in the armchair or wheelchair, looking at the garden or the ceiling, with that silence that wasn't peaceful, but of someone who had given up on being heard. Aparecida recognized that silence. She had lived within it for a while after losing her husband and not knowing who to talk to at night. On a rainy Tuesday, while polishing the floor near the window, she heard Mrs. Eleanor murmur something softly. Not to her, but to the wet garden outside, to the leaves darkened by the rain, to no one in particular. Aparecida paused, stood quietly for a second, then carefully asked, "Did you say something, ma'am?" "Missus." Eleanor slowly turned her head, looking at her with a strangeness that Aparecida took a moment to understand. It was the strangeness of someone who hadn't been heard in a long time, of someone who had spoken so many times to silence that she no longer expected a response. The two looked at each other for a moment. Mrs. Eleanor didn't answer, but she didn't avert her gaze. Aparecida returned to her work without forcing anything further. But when she left the room that afternoon, she had a certainty that hadn't been there when she entered. That lady had a lot of things trapped inside her chest. And someone, at some point, had decided it was easier to leave the door closed than to hear what she had to say. What Aparecida didn't know yet was that this choice to stop, to ask, to wait, had been noticed. Not by Mrs. Eleanor, but by someone else in that house. Someone who was paying attention to everything and didn't like what they saw. Aparecida didn't plan anything. It just happened the way true things often do. Slowly, without warning, almost imperceptibly. The next morning, that rainy Tuesday, she returned to the room with her cleaning supplies and found Mrs. Eleanor in the same armchair. Looking at the garden that was now dry, the nurse had gone to fetch medication. The two were alone for the first time. Aparecida worked in silence for a while. She carefully wiped the shelf, avoiding the old photos without moving them. In one of them, there was a young woman in front of a blackboard, wearing a white apron, smiling at the camera with the confidence of someone who belongs exactly where they are in the world. "This is a beautiful photo, Aparecida," she said without thinking much. Mrs. Eleanor didn't respond, but her eyes went to the photo. "Were you a teacher, ma'am?" A long pause. The garden outside. The distant sound of a car passing on the street. Then very softly, almost without opening her mouth. For 31 years, Aparecida continued cleaning. She asked no more questions, didn't force conversation, but when she left the room, Mrs. Eleanor was looking at the photo and no longer at the garden. It was a small difference, but it was a difference. That's how it began, with a simple question, a 3-word answer, and 2 women who simultaneously understood that silence was no longer mandatory. In the following days, Aparecida gradually learned that Mrs. Eleanor loved the 8 p.m. drama and complained when the plot didn't make sense, that she had been married for 40 years to a man who laughed easily and died suddenly of a heart attack one Sunday morning without warning, that she liked tea with a lot of sugar, the way the nurse no longer allowed because of her diabetes, but that she would accept a biscuit now and then without telling anyone, that she had taught children from underprivileged neighborhoods for most of her life, and that many of these students still sent her messages on her birthday, even without knowing she could no longer properly reply on her phone. Aparecida listened to everything. Sometimes she laughed along. Sometimes she remained quiet and let the lady speak until she was empty. There was no rush, no script. It was just 2 people sharing the same piece of mourning. In one of these conversations, Mrs. Eleanor spoke of her fracture. It had happened 2 years earlier, on a silly Saturday afternoon like any other. She was trying to reach a book on the top shelf, lost her balance, and fell. Henry was traveling. The nurse had left early that day. It was the neighbors who heard the noise and called for help. Mrs. Eleanor lay on the floor for almost an hour before anyone arrived. Her son appeared 3 days later. The surgery had already passed. Aparecida listened to this part without comment. She just continued folding the towel in her hands, slowly, very carefully, as if she needed something to do while processing what she had heard. "He has many commitments, Mrs. Eleanor said in the gentle voice of someone who had been repeating this for a long time, as if it were an explanation, a comfort she had invented for herself so she wouldn't need another. "I see." Aparecida replied only that. "Mrs. Eleanor looked at her, remained silent for an instant, then averted her gaze to the window and didn't touch the subject again. Over time, the back room became the only place in that house where there was genuine human warmth. Laughter now and then, one story leading to another. Mrs. Eleanor began to anticipate the mornings with a lightness that the nurse noted in the very first week. She woke before her usual time, combed her hair alone, asked to change her blouse for what she called the pretty blue one with mother-of-pearl buttons that her husband had brought from a trip many years ago. "It looks better this way," she would say, without explaining to whom. The nurse thought it good, didn't ask why, just noted in her chart that the patient was more communicative and continued her day. Henry noticed nothing. He arrived late, left early, and the back room was on the other side of the house, too far from his schedule to appear on his radar. But Isabella noticed. One Wednesday morning, Aparecida was sitting on the edge of the empty armchair, listening to Mrs. Eleanor tell about a student who had become a doctor and returned years later to thank her. Mrs. Eleanor chuckled as she told it, that soft chuckle of someone recalling something that brought them joy. Aparecida laughed along, cleaning cloth still in hand, completely oblivious to the time. That's when she sensed a presence at the door. Isabella was standing in the doorway, without having knocked, without having made any sound. She wasn't angry, she wasn't agitated. She was just looking at Mrs. Eleanor, at Aparecida, at the small distance between the 2 chairs, with that calm attention of someone recording every detail to use later. Aparecida. The voice was tranquil, as always. "The kitchen needs you." "Coming, Mrs. Isabella." Isabella didn't move immediately. She stayed for a few more seconds, her eyes sweeping the room one last time. Then she turned and left, without haste, without a sound, without another word. The room grew quiet. Mrs. Eleanor looked at the closed door with an expression that Aparecida took a moment to understand. It wasn't fear, it was recognition. It was the look of someone who had seen this before and knew what usually came next. "Go," the lady said in a firm voice. And don't give them a reason. Aparecida went. She worked the rest of the day in the kitchen without crossing paths with Isabella more than necessary. Each time their paths neared, there was a different quality in the air. It wasn't open hostility. It was something more subtle, colder, the kind of tension that doesn't need words because it's already spoken in the silence. That night, leaving through the back gate, Aparecida paused for a second on the sidewalk. She thought of Isabella's gaze at the door, the extra second she had lingered before leaving. That calmness that wasn't truly calm but control. The patience of someone who had already made a decision and was just waiting for the right moment to execute it. Aparecida didn't know what was going to happen, but she knew with that certainty that comes from the body before reaching the mind that something had changed in that house, and that the change wasn't going to be good for her. Isabella Thompson wasn't the kind of woman who lost control. She never had been. From a young age, she had learned that those who shout lose ground, those who cry lose respect, and those who wait with patience win any dispute that time resolves. It was a conviction she had built over the years, and her marriage to Henry had only confirmed what she already knew. The world belongs to those who know how to be quiet at the right time. The marriage had never been about love. On that, Isabella had no illusions. It had been about position, about stability, about the kind of life she had decided to have even before meeting Henry. He was exactly what she was looking for. Successful, focused, predictable in his ambitions, and little interested in examining what happened inside the house as long as the surface was tidy. It was an arrangement that worked for both of them, and Isabella guarded it with the same coldness with which she managed everything else in her life. What she managed most carefully was Mrs. Eleanor, not out of affection, but out of necessity. Her mother-in-law knew things about the marriage, about the family's past, about choices Isabella had made before becoming the lady of that house. As long as Mrs. Eleanor remained quiet in that room, absorbed in her own silence, the past stayed where Isabella had put it, buried, controlled, far from any conversation that might reach Henry's ears. That's why, when her mother-in-law had stopped speaking, Isabella had done nothing to change it. She had called doctors, ensured a nurse, signed papers, and scheduled exams. The box was checked, her conscience clear, but none of the weekly 5-minute visits had been designed to reconnect that woman to the world. They were visits to maintain appearances, to be seen doing what a good daughter-in-law should do. And then Aparecida appeared. Isabella had noticed the change before understanding what was happening. First, it was the schedule. The nurse commented that Mrs. Eleanor was waking up earlier. Then it was the blue blouse the elderly lady started asking for every morning. Then it was the smile Isabella glimpsed as she passed through the corridor. Mrs. Eleanor laughing at something the cleaner had said with that open laughter Isabella hadn't seen in years. That bothered her in a way she hadn't anticipated. Her first response was to control the space. Isabella reorganized the house's schedule with precision. She changed the cleaning time for Mrs. Eleanor's room to the time when the elderly lady usually napped after lunch. She instructed the nurse to keep the door closed so as not to interrupt her rest and began circulating through the corridor. At times, she knew Aparecida would be there. Not to forbid, but to be present, so that every step Aparecida took in that direction felt like a watched step. Aparecida felt it but kept going. Then Isabella decided to speak. She chose a morning when Henry had left before 6 a.m. and the house was just theirs. She waited for Aparecida to finish tidying the pantry, let the silence settle for a moment, and leaned against the kitchen doorframe, arms crossed, her voice in the tone of someone being reasonable while not being. "You're an intelligent woman, Aparecida." Aparecida looked up from what she was doing but didn't respond. Intelligent enough to know that an employee who forms a bond with the employer creates problems. Isabella paused briefly. A calculated silence. "I advise you to do your job and leave my mother-in-law in peace." The kitchen was quiet. Aparecida looked at her for a second, not with anger, not with fear, but with the calm of someone who had heard, understood, and hadn't yet decided what to do with the information. "Right, Mrs. Isabella," she said, and returned to work. Isabella stood for another moment, as if expecting something more, a reaction, an apology, anything that showed the message had landed correctly. But Aparecida simply continued working, without trembling, without explaining, without apologizing for anything. Isabella moved away from the door without another word, and Aparecida returned to the back room the next morning, as if the conversation had never happened. That's when Isabella understood that the warning hadn't been enough. That woman wouldn't yield to pressure. She wasn't that type. Something else would be needed. Something that didn't depend on Aparecida's will. Something that would take the choice away from her entirely. Isabela spent 2 days observing the house's routine with heightened attention. The times Aparecida worked alone, the rooms she accessed unsupervised, the cupboards, the drawers, the spaces where a person might be seen doing something they shouldn't. She was looking for an opening, and one Thursday afternoon, as she mentally reorganized every detail, she found exactly what she needed. It wasn't a sudden idea, it was a conclusion. The difference between the two is that one leaves and the other stays. Isabela stood alone in the living room for a long moment, looking out at the garden. Then she went to get the envelope. The envelope was simple, white, unmarked, the kind bought at any stationery store. Isabela placed inside it an amount of money that was not small enough to go unnoticed and not large enough to seem exaggerated. It was exactly the amount that would make a person pause, look twice, and start asking questions. She chose the drawer carefully. It had to be a place Aparecida would need to open in the normal course of her work. Not a hidden place, not too obvious. The pantry had a storage cupboard in the back with shelves of items that needed to be restocked every week. Aparecida opened that cupboard every Thursday to organize what had arrived in the delivery. It was routine. It was predictable. It was perfect. Isabela placed the envelope in the bottom drawer of the cupboard on Wednesday night, after the house had emptied. Then she went to sleep. On Thursday morning, Aparecida arrived at her usual time, changed her shoes in the back hallway, put on her apron, and started her day in the kitchen. It was a normal morning. Sun through the window, coffee warming on the stove, the day's task list in her head. She wasn't worried about anything. There was no reason to be. When it was time to organize the stock, she went to the pantry, opened the cupboard, and started working. Counting packages, separating what was left, noting what was missing in the small notebook she had started using so she wouldn't forget anything. She opened the bottom drawer and froze. The white envelope was there, among the stock items, in a place no envelope had any reason to be. She looked at it without touching it. She looked at the pantry door, which was ajar. She looked back at the envelope. She didn't open it. She didn't pick it up. She slowly closed the drawer and stood quiet for a moment, her hand still on the wood, trying to understand what she was seeing. It was at that moment that she heard footsteps. Isabela entered the pantry with Henry beside her, discussing something about lunch in a casual tone that seemed too natural to be natural. Aparecida instinctively moved away from the cupboard. Isabela glanced around the pantry, as if checking something trivial. She walked to the storage cupboard and opened the bottom drawer with the confident hand of someone who knew exactly what she would find. 2 seconds of silence. Henry saw the envelope. Isabela let the pause last a moment longer than it needed to. Then she slowly closed the drawer, without taking anything out, and turned to her husband with an expression Aparecida would never forget. It wasn't anger. It wasn't surprise. It was sadness. The perfect sadness of someone who didn't want to be right, but was. "I didn't want to believe it," she said in a low voice. "But this is the second time I've noticed something wrong in this house." Henry looked at the drawer, then at Aparecida. Aparecida opened her mouth to speak. "You can go finish the rest, Aparecida," Henry said before she could. The tone wasn't a question. It was the tone of someone who was already processing, already deciding, and didn't want to be interrupted by anything that might complicate what was almost ready in his mind. Aparecida left the pantry with her notebook in hand and heavy feet. Outside, she leaned against the corridor wall for a second. Her heart was beating out of its normal rhythm. She knew what had just happened, not in detail, but in essence. She knew the way one knows when the ground shifts before one sees the whole. Inside the pantry, the conversation continued in low voices. Aparecida didn't try to listen. There was nothing to hear that would change what was already in motion. What she didn't know, what no one knew yet, was that there had been a witness to that moment whom Isabela had forgotten to account for. The corridor leading to the pantry passed in front of Mrs. Eleanor's room window, and Mrs. Eleanor that morning had asked the nurse to open the window because the sun was beautiful. She was sitting there with the window open when she saw Isabela enter the pantry with Henry. She saw the way she entered, the timing, the composition of the entire scene, set with the precision of someone who had rehearsed without rehearsing. Mrs. Eleanor had been a teacher for 31 years. She had learned to read situations before reading words. And what she read that morning through the open window with the Thursday sun was a lie being built brick by brick. She remained quiet. She called no one. She said nothing, storing it away the way one stores something not yet ready to be used, but which will be. Friday began like any other. Aparecida arrived on time, changed her shoes, put on her apron. The sun streamed through the kitchen window as always. Coffee was ready. The task list was the same as every week. She took a deep breath and started the day. But something was different. It wasn't anything you could point to. It was a quality of the silence, more closed, heavier. Isabella had passed through the kitchen earlier than usual and hadn't said good morning, Mrs. Eleanor's nurse had averted her gaze in the corridor, like someone who knew something it wasn't her place to tell. And Henry, who usually left before 7 a.m. without looking at anyone, was in his office with the door closed at 8:30 a.m. Aparecida worked without stopping, cleaned, organized, did what needed to be done. She tried not to think about the envelope. She tried not to think about Henry's gaze in the pantry 2 days earlier, that instant when he had raised his hand to cut her off mid-sentence. At 11 a.m., Henry's personal assistant appeared in the kitchen. He wants to speak with you in his office. The walk to the office was short, but Aparecida felt every step. The marble of the corridor, the dark wood of the door, the cold doorknob in her hand. She entered. Henry was standing behind his desk, arms crossed. There was no chair by the side of the desk to sit on. This wasn't a conversation, it was a communication. He didn't look her in the eyes immediately. He looked at a spot just above her head, the way certain people look when they have already made a decision and don't want to be challenged by human details. "We have identified inappropriate conduct on your part within this house," he said. The tone was the same he used in construction site meetings, dry, definitive, leaving no room for rebuttal. "Your termination is immediate. Your severance will be processed on Monday." Aparecida stood still. The office was quiet. Outside, a bird sang in the garden. She heard this without knowing why. She noted that detail. The bird in the garden, the sun in the window behind Henry, the heavy silence between them. She opened her mouth. "I didn't. You can go retrieve your belongings." He lowered his eyes to the desk, to the papers in front of him, as if she had already left. His hand gave a clear signal, concluded. No witnesses, no defense, no benefit of a second of doubt. The decision had been made before she entered that room, probably before Thursday, probably since the moment Isabella had closed that drawer with the expression of someone who didn't want to be right. Aparecida stood still for another second. It wasn't anger she felt. Anger would have been easier to bear. It was that heavy mixture of injustice and helplessness, the kind of thing that tightens the chest and doesn't know where to escape. She had done everything right. She had arrived on time, had worked diligently, had treated that house with respect, and none of it had mattered for a second in Henry's scales. She left the office without slamming the door. Isabella wasn't in the corridor. Aparecida noticed her absence. It was the deliberate kind of absence, of someone who doesn't want to be seen near the scene she helped to set. In the back staff locker, she took out the few things that were hers. A spare pair of sneakers, a jacket, a small notebook, a tiny photograph of her daughter that she kept folded in her wallet. She put everything in her bag slowly, without haste, as if that slowness was the only thing still under her control. She picked up her apron, folded it carefully, placed it on the shelf from where she had taken it on her first day, looked at it for a moment, then turned and walked away down the corridor. She stopped in front of Mrs. Eleanor's room. The door was ajar. Inside, the nurse had gone to lunch. Mrs. Eleanor was in the armchair with the blue blouse with mother-of-pearl buttons, looking out the window. When she heard Aparecida's footsteps, she turned her head. The two looked at each other for a moment. Mrs. Eleanor didn't ask what had happened. She didn't need to. The way Aparecida was there, without her apron, with a bag in her hand at an hour that wasn't for leaving, said everything. "Come in," the lady said. Aparecida entered, closed the door. What happened inside that room in the next 20 minutes, no one in the house could hear or see. The door remained closed, the voices too low to leak into the corridor, and the garden outside remained quiet, as if the world didn't know what was being said within. But something was said, because when Aparecida opened the door 20 minutes later, she had entered carrying the weight of an injustice she couldn't prove, and she left with something else, not lighter, but different, with the expression of someone who had finally understood something they needed to understand. She walked down the corridor, crossed the living room, passed over the marble of the entrance, and stopped on the sidewalk. She stood there with her bag in hand, breathing the outside air for the first time that day. She hadn't planned what came next. The sound behind her was soft. The slow turning of a wheelchair's wheels on the indoor floor, then the small step down at the threshold, then the concrete of the sidewalk. Aparecida didn't need to turn to know who it was, but she did. Mrs. Eleanor was there, her purse on her lap, her hands firm on the wheels of her chair, the blue blouse with mother-of-pearl buttons, and a calmness on her face that wasn't resignation, but decision. The calm of someone who had taken a long time to act and finally had. The two stood side by side on the sidewalk, in front of Thompson Manor, under the same Friday sun. Inside, someone had seen them. Henry had gone up to the second floor after the office meeting. It wasn't his custom to be home at that hour. Normally, he would already be at a construction site or in a meeting room across town. But something had held him there that morning. Perhaps the discomfort he still hadn't been able to name since the pantry on Thursday. Perhaps the way Aparecida had left his office without showing any of the expressions he expected. He was on the second floor balcony when he first saw Aparecida, standing on the sidewalk with her bag in hand, her back to the manor. Then the sound of the wheels. Then his mother crossing the threshold with her hands firm on the wheels, descending the small step of the entrance with an ease he hadn't seen in years, and stopping beside Aparecida on the sidewalk, as if that were the most natural place in the world for her to be. Henry stood on the balcony for a few seconds. He wasn't a man who hesitated to react. In 30 years of business, he had learned that hesitation costs dearly. But this time he stood still, hands on the railing, looking at the two women on the sidewalk with a strangeness that was neither anger nor confusion. It was something he didn't quite recognize because he hadn't felt it many times in his life. He descended the stairs faster than he had in years. He crossed the living room, the corridor, the marble of the entrance, opened the front door, and stood in the doorway, looking at his own mother on the sidewalk, 10 meters away, beside an employee he had fired 40 minutes earlier. "Mom." His voice came out lower than he intended. "What are you doing out there?" Mrs. Eleanor didn't answer immediately. She kept looking at him with that calmness that was no longer the apathetic calm of recent years. It was something else. It was the calm of someone who had decided. "I'm going for a walk," she said simply. "You can't be on the street alone, Mom. Let me call Claudia. I'm not alone." Henry looked at Aparecida. Aparecida looked back at him, without averting her gaze, without explaining, without asking for anything. He opened his mouth and stayed that way for a moment. He, who was never speechless in any meeting, who had learned early on that silence is weakness and words are power, stood with his mouth open in his own doorway, unable to form a coherent sentence in the face of what he was seeing. That's when Isabella appeared behind him. She had heard Henry's quick steps descending the stairs and had followed him. She reached the door and saw the scene at the same time as she processed its meaning. Mrs. Eleanor, the sidewalk, Aparecida, the purse on her mother-in-law's lap, the blue blouse with mother-of-pearl buttons. The smile didn't come. It was the first time in a long time that the smile didn't appear when she needed it. "Mrs. Eleanor," Isabella said in her usual controlled, reasonable tone. "It's cold out. Let's go inside. I'll make you some tea." "Isabella." "Mrs." Eleanor's voice was low, but with a thread of steel within it. Enough. The silence that followed lasted perhaps 3 seconds. It seemed much longer. Mrs. Eleanor turned her eyes to her son, looking at him in a way Henry couldn't avoid. Not with anger, not with easy judgment, but with something far heavier than both. Pity. The pity of someone who had loved and watched it go to waste. "Henry," she said, "I have loved you all your life. I raised you with what I had. I was proud of what you built, but at some point along the way, you learned to look at everything and see nothing. This woman," she made a light gesture towards Aparecida, "was the only person in this house in the last 2 years who stopped to ask me how I was. Just that, and you dismissed her as if she were a problem." Henry didn't respond. "I needed help one Saturday afternoon and lay on the floor for an hour waiting for someone to appear. You arrived 3 days later." She paused, not to hurt, but so the truth had space to land. "I don't hold a grudge against you for that, but I'm also not going to pretend anymore that everything is fine when it's not." The garden was quiet. Down the street, a car passed slowly. The Friday sun shone equally on everyone on the sidewalk. "You're coming back inside," Henry said, and his voice had a fragility he couldn't hide. "This isn't a place for you to be. I know where my place is, son." "Mrs." Eleanor placed her hands back on the wheelchair's rims firmly. "And for now, it's not in there." Henry looked at Aparecida once more. There was a question in his gaze that he didn't know how to formulate. A question that mixed incomprehension with something that, if he were honest, was the beginning of a shame he wasn't yet ready to admit. Aparecida said nothing. She remained where she was, beside Mrs. Eleanor, neither backing down nor confronting. Simply present. Isabella had taken a step back onto the threshold. Her face was closed in a way Henry hadn't seen before. It wasn't sadness. It was the face of someone who realized a plan that seemed perfect had a flaw she hadn't calculated. And the flaw was 81 years old, with white hair and a blue blouse with mother-of-pearl buttons. Henry stood in the doorway for another moment, then went inside, not because he had given up, but because he needed to think. He needed a place where the scene he had just witnessed wasn't in front of his eyes. And at that moment, there was no such place in the whole world. Outside, Mrs. Eleanor took a deep breath. The street air smelled different from the air in the back room. She had forgotten that. "Thank you for staying," she said to Aparecida in a low voice. Aparecida looked at her, felt her throat tighten in a way that wasn't sadness and wasn't joy. It was both things together, in the same place, not knowing which came first. "I'm the one who thanks you, Mrs. Eleanor," she replied. The two stayed there for a while longer on the sidewalk, in no hurry to go anywhere. But inside the manor, something had begun to stir. And Henry, alone in his office with the door closed, was about to discover that the story of the envelope had a version he still hadn't heard. Henry stayed alone in his office for almost half an hour. He didn't answer his phone, didn't open his computer. He sat in the leather chair, where he had made hundreds of decisions over the years, contracts, dismissals, projects, agreements, and for the first time, he didn't know what to do with the silence inside him. The scene on the sidewalk wouldn't leave his head. It wasn't his mother's image that disturbed him. It was what she had said, the way she had said it, without anger, without drama, with that heavy serenity of someone who had chosen her words carefully, knowing that the right words don't need shouting. 3 days after the surgery, he had arrived. 3 days later. Henry knew this fact. He had lived with it, had built around it a series of justifications that, at that moment, seemed made of paper. The project was at a critical stage. The trip couldn't be cancelled. The surgery had already passed. She was stable. There was a nurse, there was support, all true. And at the same time, in the way his mother had put it on the sidewalk, all insufficient. He was thinking about this when the office door opened. He expected Isabella. It was always Isabella who appeared at such moments, with a cup of coffee, with a reasonable phrase, with that way of organizing the air around him until the discomfort vanished. But it wasn't Isabella, it was Mrs. Eleanor's nurse, with the uncomfortable face of someone sent to do something she preferred not to do. "Mrs. Eleanor asked to speak with you, sir," she said. "She's back inside, in her room." Henry paused for a second, then stood up. The corridor to the back room seemed longer than he remembered, perhaps because he didn't usually walk it slowly. Normally, on the rare occasions he went there, it was quick. He would enter, ask how she was, hear 1 or 2 monosyllables, and leave within 15 minutes. The box checked. Now he went slowly, hands in his pockets, looking at the floor he knew Aparecida had polished dozens of times. He knocked on the door. "Come in." The room had the window open. The afternoon light entered sideways, golden, and caught the photos on the shelf in a way Henry hadn't noticed before. The photo of his young mother in front of the blackboard, his father laughing on a beach, a class of students lined up in the courtyard of a school he didn't recognize. Mrs. Eleanor was in the armchair, her hands on her lap, tranquil. Henry pulled the desk chair and sat in front of her. Not at the desk. In front, the way one sits when there is no table to place between people. "Mom," he began. "Let me speak first," she said gently. "Then, you can say whatever you want." He closed his mouth. "Mrs. Eleanor looked at him for a moment before beginning. It wasn't the look of someone about to attack. It was the look of someone about to say something difficult, because she cared about who was listening. "On Thursday morning, I had the window open," she said. "I saw Isabella enter the pantry with you. I saw the way she entered, the timing, the way she stood waiting for you to open the drawer." Henry said nothing. "I was a teacher for 31 years, son. I learned to recognize when a situation has been staged." She paused briefly. That was staged. Henry's office was on the other side of the house. But the silence he felt at that moment was the same silence he had felt there. Only deeper, more inescapable. When Aparecida came to say goodbye, Mrs. Eleanor continued. "I told her what I saw, not because I wanted to create trouble, but because that woman didn't deserve to leave this house carrying a lie." Henry remained quiet for a long time. The garden outside, the birds singing now and then, the golden light on the photo of his young mother at the blackboard. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" he asked, and his voice had a small crack he couldn't hide. "Because you didn't come here, Henry." The answer was simple, without accusation, just truth. "And because I needed to be sure of what I had seen before speaking." Henry slowly stood up, remained standing for a moment with his back to his mother, looking out the window at the garden. Then he turned. "I'm going to talk to Isabella." "I know," Mrs. Eleanor said. He walked to the door, paused with his hand on the doorknob. "Mom," he didn't turn. "I'm sorry for everything I should have done and didn't." The room became quiet. I know, she said with that gentle voice of someone who forgives. Not because she forgot, but because she chose to. Go on. The conversation between Henry and Isabella took place in the living room, with the door closed, and lasted just under an hour. No one in the house stayed close enough to hear what was said. But when the door opened, Isabella came out first with an expression no smile could cover, and went straight to the master bedroom, without looking at anyone. Henry remained in the living room for a few more minutes. Then he asked his assistant for Aparecida's contact information. He called her that same afternoon. Aparecida was at home with her daughter when the phone rang. She saw the number, looked at the screen for a moment, and answered. The conversation was short. Henry was not a man of circumlocution, and this time there was no circumlocution that would fit. He said he had been informed that the situation had been different from what was presented to him. He said the dismissal had been a mistake. He asked if she would be willing to return. Aparecida was silent for a few seconds. It's not just about coming back, Mr. Thompson, she said calmly. It's about knowing this won't happen again. It won't, he replied. And there was a weight in his voice that wasn't an empty promise. It was the weight of a man who had looked inside his home and disliked what he saw. Aparecida returned the following Monday, entered through the back gate, changed her shoes, put on her apron, and went straight to the back room. Missus! Eleanor was in the armchair with the blue blouse with mother-of-pearl buttons, looking out the window. When she heard Aparecida's footsteps, she turned her head. She said nothing, just offered a small smile, the kind that doesn't need words because it says everything that needs to be said. Aparecida pulled up a chair, sat beside her, and the two stayed there for a while, looking at the garden together. Outside, the sun was beautiful, and in that back room that the rest of the house had forgotten, there was more life than in any other room of that manner. Sometimes, that's how justice arrives, not with noise, not with fanfare, but with a chair pulled up, an open window, and two people who decided that the silence had lasted long enough. Sometimes, the mistake isn't what we do, it's what we choose not to see. Inside that house, there was no lack of money, but a lack of attention. And it took someone from outside to remind them of the basic truth. Caring for someone isn't an obligation, it's a choice.